Good morning. This is Saturday, October 12th, 2025. This is Brian Apavu calling on a relatively stormy day in the Arizona desert. Always pretty when it's a little rainy and a little stormy. You might hear some thunderstorm, and I may need to stop this prematurely, but we'll see how this goes. It's not storming at the moment, and I'm able to walk outside. Anyway, I wanted to share thoughts that I have this morning, and the topic I want to talk about has to do with kind of an extension of knowledge creation, which I talked about in the past, and I'll probably formally discuss a little bit more in more lecture-style videos. But the book I'm reading currently right now is a new book from the Conjecture Institute from Arjun Kamani called The Lord of the Cosmos. I'll put it in the show notes below. For anybody who's unfamiliar with that organization, they are big proponents of the epistemology of Karl Popper and more recent writings from David Deutsch, a quantum physicist who's written books called The Fabric of Our Reality and The Beginning of Our Infinity, where he sort of talks from a scientific and quantum physicist perspective of how knowledge creation is infinite. There's an idea that you have something called Acroba's trilemma, where whenever you try to get to a truth, you can almost never get to an absolute truth, because there's always more questions to ask, and particularly regarding to observations that we see in the world and forming explanatory models and trying to get at being able to refine your model a little bit more with better explanations and increasing knowledge, and therefore existing in a world where knowledge is infinite. Hence the title of one of his books, Beginning of Infinity. Anyhow, in this particular book, it starts out with a couple chapters regarding static and dynamic societies, and I found this quite interesting. I mean, first there was a discussion about static societies and really a discussion about Sparta, and actually Arjun Kamani has a really good documentary set of videos that kind of go over the book, and I'll put those in the show links as well. But the static societies are very similar to Sparta, and you may have watched the beginning of 300, and they kind of touch at this, even though it's an elaborate movie. They kind of touch at the society of Sparta, where culture is very standardized and culture is extremely traditional. If you try to relay it into Jordan Peterson's concepts of chaos and order, static societies have extreme order. There is a culture, there is a desire to adhere to the culture, and any sort of deviation from the culture is shunned upon and potentially ostracized at times in violent manners. So when we think about Sparta, Spartan sons are promoted very early in their life to become warriors and soldiers, and if they're too weak to live up to those standards, they may die. And I haven't watched 300 in a while, but I remember the beginning of it being pretty visceral in terms of its description of it, and it seems like some of this is relatively historically accurate. So a boy who didn't want to be a soldier for Sparta, didn't want to fight violently, and maybe wanted to think differently or become a philosopher king, would have been shunned in that sort of a society. And from a medic perspective and an evolutionary perspective, these kind of individuals would be cast out in society. They wouldn't evolve. They wouldn't be part of the evolving culture, and therefore that society, those static societies, never evolve and never get better. And that's kind of the description of Sparta. Extremely traditional, extremely ordered. And I do see with this concept very much when I think about Jordan Peterson's work in terms of 12 Rules for Life, and 12 More Rules for Life and Maps of Meaning. I mean, this whole concept of chaos and order really comes into mind for me, just as I've read some of those books. And so this is, Sparta represents a static society. That's a really a really very much symbolic and representative of high tradition, high order. And then you also have dynamic societies, and that's chapter 2 in the book, where they parallel that, Sparta with Athens, and Athens being a very different type of environment where, different ideas could emerge, and not easily, right? Athens is where you get Socrates, and Socrates, has his approach, and he challenges existing priests and hierarchy and politicians at his time, and then he has his own disciple Plato, who goes on to write The Death of Socrates, where, as we all know, that Socrates was put to death, and then Plato really wrote a very compelling historical depiction of that. And Socrates was put to death, so not everything was completely dynamic in Athens, but you had this sort of society where some of this could evolve, and Socrates gets a chance to get out into the public and to challenge individuals and to get people thinking in the community and the young people thinking. And then you had Plato, and Plato had his school, and then Aristotle came after that. And Aristotle, challenged ideas from Plato. He challenged the concept of Plato's cave and absolute symbolic representations of a higher order, and more for something more along the lines of materialism. But with Aristotle disagreeing from his predecessor, he wasn't subject to violence or scorn or censorship from Plato, and this is kind of that opportunity and an example of being able to find disagreement and still be peaceful. Perhaps Plato saw what his predecessor Socrates, what happened to him when he challenged things, and what it means to violently censor. So, and Athens grew, and Athens evolved, and Athens became, ultimately became the historical center for so much of Greece's evolution, not Sparta. Although there's a lot to learn from Sparta, and there's a lot to admire from Sparta. Sparta, everybody, whether they read Greek literature or history or not, like, they know who Leonidas is. I mean, the movie 300, as elaborated as it is, still, is a story that people find resonating and courageous. And there's not, as you read Jordan Peterson's work, there's importance in chaos and there's importance in order. These things exist, and I think that evolution of dynamic society is important. And I mean, this concept of dynamic and static societies, I think, and I talked in another, one of my other little walks here, I talked about, the other book by William Strauss and Neil Howe, which was The Four Turning, and they go through the four secula, the four, that cycle through human history and American history, and it's all, it's all four turnings are sort of a cycle of chaos and order. So we're constantly seeing in people's literature and descriptions of different societies and organizations, there's this constant balance of structure and order, and we need to be mindful of that, and how we make that evolution is so important. I think there is something to learn from, the death of Socrates and the evolution of Aristotle, and Plato being right in the middle, right? So Plato saw what happened to Socrates. Plato saw that Socrates challenged existing priests and politicians and their dogma about gods and the world, and he inspired people, but then he was also put to death for what he thought. Violence was a part of, violence is what violent means were his end. And then in the meanwhile, when Plato has Aristotle challenging him, they both maintain challenges, but yet they civilly disagree, and they don't, there's not, people aren't going at, Plato didn't go after Aristotle for, in terms of violent means. And I mean, I think that helps history evolve. And again, like we find, in today's world, there is a lot of value we get out of reading Aristotle. There's a lot of value in reading Plato, and they didn't necessarily agree with each other. Again, getting to truth sometimes is that elephant in the that concept of the elephant and the prophet, where everybody feels the elephant. Every blind man feels an elephant differently, and they come up with a different concept of what an elephant is, but they're not all wrong. They're just seeing it from a different perspective. And I think you can think of what, Aristotle and Plato's approaches to reality and truth the same way. So I bring this all up just because, it goes back to just bringing this back to our society and where we are at this time and how much we disagree with each other and dislike each other in society. And I think we need to remain with freedom of speech and respect for individuals' opinions. We also need to be a society where when we disagree with others, we can actually articulate their position properly and not misrepresent it. One of the things I think is important in real debate, which doesn't happen very much, almost never, is two people come to the same terms about a proposition and definitions before they move forward. I think that just never happens, and we define words differently, and we come into the fallacy of reification, that we just have angership, censorship, misrepresentation, and then things don't get better. So I think this is something we need to think about in terms of how we handle disagreements with each other. We need to do a better job of being civil and being nonviolent. We also need to do a better job of understanding other positions and making sure that we come to the same terms about a proposition, even if we disagree with each other, because we'll actually find consensus if we really focus on that. And then just understanding that, if you're not doing that, you're misrepresenting others, you're involved in manipulation, and there's an inevitable cycle where you're going to end up at high risk of advocating for censorship and violence and those sort of means. So I'll stop it there. Hope you all have a great day. It's starting to rain here, so sometimes the raindrops actually stop the video by falling directly on the stop button. So before that happens, I'll close this up. Hope you all have a wonderful day.